The content of this episode is for entertainment purposes only. Historical events and figures discussed are based on documented records, scholarly research, and primary sources. The Velvet Guillotine does not endorse any political, religious, or ideological interpretation of the events portrayed. This episode contains discussions of racial medical exploitation and systematic injustice. Listener discretion is definitely advised. In the main episode this week, we followed the body trade, from the Resurrection Men of Edinburgh to the Anatomy Act of 1832. And it was a journey through the legal and illegal machinery that kept anatomy schools running for over a century on the bodies of people who had no say-so in the matter. And I ended that episode with a warning. I said the pattern didn't end. I said it changed its form. And I said it just changed its lab coat. And this episode is the postscript where we follow that thread. Because what I want to talk about today, this happened in 1951 in Baltimore, Maryland, at Johns Hopkins Hospital. And it did not involve a graveyard. It did not involve shovels or lanterns or men working in the dark. It involved a blood pressure cuff and a tissue sample and a medical system that had not, in the 119 years since the Anatomy Act was passed, that medical system had not meaningfully updated its assumptions about whose body existed for what purpose. And the lady that I want to talk about today, her name is Henrietta Lacks. And if you've ever received a vaccine, benefited from cancer research, or taken a medication developed through the 20th century biomedical science, there is a reasonable chance that you owe something real and specific and measurable to this woman. This woman, whose own family couldn't even afford health insurance for most of the decades that her cells were saving the world. Welcome back to the Velvet Guillotine. I'm April Rain, and let's talk about Gila. Henrietta Lacks was born on August 1st, 1920 in Roanoke, Virginia. She was the ninth of 10 children. Her mother died when she was 4, and she was raised by her grandfather in Clover, Virginia, in a log cabin that had once been slave quarters. That detail is not incidental. The specific geography of Henrietta Lacks' life, from the plantation county to the former slave cabin to the particular poverty of an African American family in the rural Jim Crow South, that's all part of the story in a way that is inseparable from what happened to her body later. And the same currents of history that shaped her life, shaped the conditions under which her cells were actually taken. She married her cousin David Lacks in 1941 and moved to Baltimore, where David found work at the Bethlehem Steel Plant at Sparrows Point. They had 5 children, and by all accounts, she was warm, generous, a good cook, and someone who laughed easily, and was deeply present with the people around her. In January of 1951, she went to Johns Hopkins Hospital complaining of vaginal bleeding. She was diagnosed with cervical cancer. She was only 30 years old. Johns Hopkins was, at that time, one of the only hospitals in Baltimore that treated African American patients. Segregation was the operating condition of American medicine at that time. African American patients who needed hospital care in much of the country had a choice between Black hospitals, which were fewer, less well-funded, and operating with fewer resources. Or they could choose the segregated wings of white hospitals, where they received care that was frequently inferior in ways, and that was both deliberate and structural. Henrietta Lacks received her cancer treatment in a colored ward. Now, I want to stop right here. Please understand that at the time, segregation was indoctrinated in our culture, and there were Black establishments and white establishments. Segregation was a real thing, especially in the South, and especially in the 50s. But let's get back to Henrietta. She had a biopsy procedure, and during that, without her knowledge and without her consent, A sample of her tumor cells were taken by a physician named George Gay. The cells were given to his laboratory, and his lab had been trying for years to develop a line of human cells that could survive and reproduce in a culture, which means outside of the body in a laboratory setting. And he was looking for human cells that could survive and reproduce long enough to be useful for research. Human cells, it turned out, they tended to die quickly. They were fragile, and they didn't last. But Henrietta Lacks' cells didn't die. In fact, her cells grew, and they doubled every 20 to 24 hours. They were, in the language of cell biology, immortal. They were capable of reproducing indefinitely under the right laboratory conditions. And Gay had never seen anything like this before. And he named the cell line Gila after his patient. Except he didn't use her real name. He told the world the cells came from a woman named Helen Lane. Some accounts say Helen Larson. The fictional name absolutely varies, but the function was the same. And that function was to obscure the origin of the cells and to put a white-sounding name on a discovery made from the body of an African-American woman. Henrietta Lacks died on October the 4th, 1951. She was only 31 years old. She was buried in an unmarked grave in Clover, Virginia, and her cells were already in laboratories around the country. I want to spend some time on what Gila cells actually built, because I think it is important to be specific rather than vague about this, because the magnitude of this contribution is not rhetoric, it is very well documented. In 1952, Jonas Salk needed a way to test his polio vaccine at scale. Polio was killing and paralyzing tens of thousands of Americans each year, and most of them were children. Developing a vaccine required the ability to grow and study the polio virus in human cells in quantities that had never been achievable before. And Gila cells, well, they made all of that possible. The infrastructure built to mass produce Gila cells for polio vaccine testing became the first industrial-scale cell culture operation in history. And the polio vaccine, which by conservative estimates has prevented hundreds of millions of cases of paralysis worldwide, every single one of those was developed and tested in Henrietta Lacks' cells. Gila cells went on to be used in cancer research, in the development of chemotherapy agents, in HIV and AIDS research. They went into space aboard early Soviet and American spacecrafts to study the effects of zero gravity on human cells. They were used in HPV vaccines. They were central to the development of in vitro fertilization techniques, and they have been used in research that has produced, by various estimates, somewhere between 11,000 and 17,000 medical patents. The pharmaceutical and biomedical industries built on Gila research generate billions of dollars each year. And the Lacks family did not receive compensation. And for decades, they didn't even know that Henrietta's cells existed. Let me be very precise about this timeline, because it truly matters. Henrietta Lacks died in 1951, and her cells were in continuous use from that point forward. Her family learned of the existence of Gila cells from a reporter, not a doctor and not an institution, and they didn't learn about it from that reporter until the 1970s. For more than 20 years, a family that struggled with poverty and lacked access to even health insurance was living alongside a story that they had never been told: that their mother's cells had become one of the most valuable biomedical materials in the history of medicine. And when they did learn, the medical establishment's responsibility was, to put it charitably, to say the least, it was very inadequate. Medical researchers contacted Henrietta's family members in the 70s and asked them for blood samples. Those blood samples were to study the genetics of the Gila cells, and they explained to the family that the blood draws were related to Henrietta, but they did not explain clearly what HeLa cells were, what they had been used for, or what the research had generated in commercial terms. But the family gave blood, and they continued not to receive any compensation or meaningful explanation. Deborah Lacks, Henrietta's daughter, spent decades of her adult life trying to understand what had happened to her mother's cells. Deborah died in 2009 before she saw any form of institutional acknowledgement. Her story, and the story of the whole family, is told with extraordinary care in Rebecca Skloot's 2010 book, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, which I will put on the required reading list for any human being interested in bioethics, medical history, or the question of how race shapes whose body is considered whose. And the question of consent is where the Henrietta Lacks story tends to get complicated in public discourse. So I want to address that directly, right now. The standard defense of what happened, the defense that was offered by Johns Hopkins and the broader medical establishment for decades, well, that runs something like this. In 1951, the practice of obtaining informed consent for tissue collection did not exist in any formal legal or regulatory sense. So that makes what George Gay did not illegal. It was standard practice at the time. No one was getting consent for tissue samples in 1951. That was simply how medicine worked. This defense is true, but it's only true in a narrow legal sense. And it is also, I would argue, profoundly insufficient. Because here is what was true in 1951, alongside that absence of formal consent requirements. Johns Hopkins had specific policies that governed the use of patient cells for research. And those policies existed because the hospital understood that there was an ethical dilemma to using patient cells without asking. The policies were ambiguous, and they were inconsistently applied, and they were clearly inadequate. But their existence demonstrates that the question of patient rights in the research was not invisible. It was being actively managed. And here is what else was also true in 1951. The history of medical research on African American bodies in America, without consent, without disclosure, without compensation, with rationalizations, rooted in the belief that African American bodies were more available and African American people were less able to assess their own interests. That history was not invisible either. It was recent. It was ongoing. The Tuskegee study had been running for 19 years by the time that Henrietta Lacks' cells were taken. The absence of formal legal consent requirements did not occur in a vacuum. It occurred in a specific context. And in that context, the people whose tissues were being taken without consent were, with significant consistency, African American and poor people. This was not an accident. This was not an oversight. This was and is a pattern operating across institutions and decades. And that reflects specific assumptions about whose body belongs to whom. The consent framework that now governs medical research in the United States, that's the Institutional Review Board system, the requirement for informed consent, the protections built into federal research, all of that framework was largely built in the wake of the Tuskegee revelation in 1972 and the political and ethical reckoning that followed. It was built in a significant part because of the documented history of exactly what happened to Henrietta Lacks and the 399 men in Alabama and the people before them and the people before them. The protection came after the harm, as it usually does. So I want to go back to the fictional name that George Gay used, Helen Lane, or Helen Larson. The deliberate decision to tell the world that the HeLa cells came from a Caucasian woman named Helen something, rather than from an African American woman named Henrietta Lacks. Because I think that decision is one of the most revealing moments in this entire story, and it doesn't get nearly enough attention. George Gay's stated reason for the fictional name was privacy, protecting the identity of his patient. This was the explanation offered at the time, and it was largely accepted in subsequent historical records. And I want to invite you to think about that explanation very, very carefully. The reason that I want you to think about that very carefully is that the privacy argument assumes that the patient whose cells were being used had interests worth protecting. Specifically, the interest in not having their name attached, without consent, to a commercial and scientific enterprise that they knew nothing about. And if Henrietta Lacks' privacy was worth protecting, then surely her consent was worth obtaining. If she had a right to anonymity after the fact, she had a right to choice before it. The privacy argument, in other words, cannot simultaneously justify the fictional name and excuse the unconsented taking. It can't protect Henrietta and use her at the same time. There is another reading, a reading that is uncomfortable and that I think is more honest. In 1951, a cell line derived from an African American woman's tumor was not a complication that most of the medical establishment was eager to publicize. The idea that one of the foundational biological research tools of the 20th century came from the body of an African American woman who grew up in a former slave cabin in Jim Crow, Virginia, that was not a story that fit easily into the self-narrated heroism of American medical science. The naming of the cells for a fictional Caucasian woman removed that complication, and it made the story cleaner. It made the science easier to celebrate. Henrietta Lacks was taken twice. Once when her tissue was removed, and once when her name was changed. In 2013, the National Institutes of Health reached an agreement with the Lacks family that gave the family members seats on a committee overseeing access to the HeLa genome, which had been sequenced and published without family consultation. The genome was not made fully public. This was presented as a significant step, and it was, but it was relative to the decades of nothing that preceded it. And it was not compensation, and it was not an apology. It was simply access to a governance process. In 2021, the Lacks family, represented by civil rights attorney Ben Crump, filed a lawsuit against Thermo Fisher Scientific, which is one of the largest biomedical companies in the world. And they are a significant commercial producer of HeLa cells. In that lawsuit, the family alleged unjust enrichment. The argument was very straightforward. Thermo Fisher had made and continues to make substantial profits from the sale of HeLa cells. And the family of the woman whose bodies had produced those cells in the first place, well, they had received nothing. In 2023, the lawsuit was settled, and the terms are very confidential. Johns Hopkins Hospital, in 2021, released a formal statement acknowledging that Henrietta Lacks' cells were taken without her knowledge or her consent, and that the hospital had contributed to significant harm to the Lacks family. The statement was not accompanied by any type of financial compensation. Now, I'm not telling you this to say that nothing has changed, because things have changed. Bioethics is a very recognized field, and informed consent is now legally required. Also, the history of Henrietta Lacks is now taught in medical schools in a way that it was not a generation ago. And I'm telling you this because the reckoning is only partial. And partial reckonings have a tendency to function as inoculations against full ones, to give institutions enough distance from the harm to say, we acknowledged it, without actually addressing the structural conditions that actually produced it. The Lacks family is not wealthy. Henrietta Lacks is not celebrated the way that the scientists who built careers on her cells are celebrated. The commercial value generated from her body over 70 years ago has not flowed to the people that she left behind. And like I said, the lab coat changed, but the logic didn't. So here is the thread that I want you to hold as you walk away from this week's episodes. The body trade of the 18th and 19th centuries operated as a principle. And that principle is that some people's bodies are available and some are not. And the availability actually flowed the lines of power with perfect consistency. The poor, the imprisoned, the impoverished, the enslaved, and the unprotected. HeLa cells, taken in 1951 in a hospital in Baltimore from an African American woman who grew up in a former slave cabin. That is the continuation of the principle, but in a different form. Not grave robbers, not murder, a blood pressure cuff and a tissue sample, and an assumption so deeply embedded in the institutional logic of American medicine that it didn't require a decision. It just required a physician, a sample, and a system that had never meaningfully asked whose body this was. Henrietta Lacks was not a specimen. She was a person. She was 30 years old. She had 5 kids. She laughed easily, and she is buried in an unmarked grave in Clover, Virginia. But her cells, they have circled the globe. She deserved to be asked. She deserved to be given a chance to give her consent, and she wasn't. This is what we are all still reckoning with. This is what the partial acknowledgments and the confidential settlements and the committee seats have not yet addressed. The foundational assumption that made all of this possible, and that has not, in 70 years, been fully dismantled. Whose body is it? Well, it was hers. It's always been hers. This has been The Velvet Guillotine. I'm April Rain. I just want to take a moment to say that Rebecca Skloot's The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks is essential reading. Read it if you haven't. Henrietta Washington's Medical Apartheid, that provides the broader scope. It provides the full history of medical exploitation of African American bodies in America. And that is what makes the Lacks story comprehensible, not just as an anomaly, but as a culmination. Stay dark.